The monk almost missed her. He had been travelling for the better part of a year east from Constantinople, east through the vast grasslands of the steppe, east through cold that he later described as unlike anything he had known in France. His name was William of Rubruck. He was a Franciscan friar, a man of books and prayers and careful observation sent by King Louis IX of France on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court. He rode on horseback with guides he could barely communicate with through landscapes so empty and so enormous that he sometimes felt he had ridden off the edge of the known world entirely. He arrived at Karakorum, the capital city of the Mongol Empire, in the winter of 1253. And there, inside a felt tent at the center of the largest empire on earth, he heard something that stopped him cold. French. A woman's voice. Speaking French. He turned. She was sitting near the back of the tent, her hands busy with some task he could not immediately identify. She looked up when she heard him speak. Her name was Pasha. She was from somewhere in France. The exact region is not recorded. She had a Russian husband. She had 3 small children who played near the tent entrance while their parents worked. She was by any measure alive. She was by any measure surviving. William sat down across from her. He had questions. A diplomat always has questions. But the question that came out first was not diplomatic at all. "How did you get here?" she told him. And by the time she finished, William of Rubruck, a man who had ridden across an entire continent on horseback, a man who had sat in the courts of Khans and translated the words of kings, sat in silence for a long moment before he picked up his pen. What he wrote down that day is one of the only records we have of what the Mongol conquests meant for the women who lived through them. Not the battles, not the tactics, not the famous names. The women. The ones history forgot to count. This is their story. To understand how Pasha ended up in that tent, you need to understand something about the world she was taken from and the world she was taken into. The Mongol Empire in 1253 was by every measure the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its peak, it stretched across more than 24 million square kilometers from the Pacific coast of China, all the way to the doorstep of Western Europe. Every significant city on the Eurasian continent was either inside its borders, paying tribute to it, or living in terror of it. It had been built in less than 50 years. The man who built it was Genghis Khan. He unified the scattered tribes of the Mongolian steppe in 1206 and set in motion a campaign of conquest that his sons and grandsons would carry forward for generations after his death. His armies were unlike anything the medieval world had encountered. They moved faster than any force of comparable size. They adapted, they learned. They did not simply destroy cities, they studied them, absorbed their engineers and their craftsmen and their physicians, and carried that knowledge forward to the next campaign. Every man in the empire was a soldier. There were no exceptions and no excuses. You rode, you fought, and you followed orders. That was the agreement. And Genghis Khan had one rule above all others: submit and live. Fight, and everything you love will be taken from you. He was not making empty threats. City after city learned this at enormous cost. And word traveled, that was part of the design. The survivors of a conquered city were sometimes deliberately released, sent running toward the next city to spread their stories before the Mongol horses even appeared on the horizon. Fear, it turned out, was faster than cavalry. But here is the thing that most accounts of the Mongol Empire leave out: the detail that changes the shape of everything else. Genghis Khan, the man who built this engine of conquest and terror, wrote laws to protect women. His legal code, known as the Yasa, explicitly prohibited the kidnapping of women. It prohibited forced marriage. It prohibited rape. It stated that when a young woman came of age, she herself would determine when a physical relationship began. Not her father, not her husband, her. In the 13th century, that was remarkable. Most European women of the same era had no legal standing whatsoever. They could be married off at any age to any man their father chose, with no voice in the matter. Genghis Khan's code gave Mongol women something that most women on earth at that time simply did not have: a legal voice. William of Rubruck knew some of this. He had studied what he could before his journey, and when Pasha mentioned the laws, mentioned them almost in passing with a tone he could not quite read, he thought he understood. He did not yet understand, because there was one thing Pasha had not yet told him, one boundary that the Yasa drew with absolute clarity. Those laws protected Mongol women. For women taken in war, women from conquered cities, conquered tribes, conquered kingdoms, there was no law. There was no protection. There was no voice. There was only the will of whoever held the reins. The same man who made kidnapping a crime built the machine that kidnapped millions. William set down his pen for a moment. Outside the tent, he could hear the camp moving, the low sounds of animals, the creak of wagon wheels, the voices of women calling to one another across the distance. He had thought when he first arrived that he was seeing a civilization, a functioning society, people going about the business of living. He was beginning to understand that he was seeing something else entirely. The system. And it was a system. Not a chaos began the moment a city fell. From Persian chroniclers who witnessed it from court records and military accounts, historians have been able to reconstruct what happened in the hours after a Mongol victory. It followed the same pattern so consistently across so many different cities and regions and decades that it is difficult to read it as anything other than deliberate policy. The soldiers would march every surviving inhabitant out onto the open plains outside the city walls. Men, women, children, the elderly, everyone who had not already been killed in the fighting. Then they would separate them, men on one side, women on the other. The Persian historian Juvaini, a man who served in the Mongol court and wrote extensively about its rulers, described watching this process: husbands pulled from wives, daughters dragged from fathers, families that had lived together for entire lifetimes torn apart in minutes. No one resisted, no one could. What happened next depended on a single question. Had the city fought back or had it surrendered? If it had fought, the men were executed. The process was organized, almost bureaucratic. Each Mongol soldier was assigned a quota of men to kill personally. Then the soldiers turned their attention to the women. What followed came in 3 distinct phases, each one worse than the last. The first phase was selection. Mongol commanders walked through the crowd of surviving women and identified anyone with a useful skill: weavers, seamstresses, anyone who could work leather or cloth or metal. These women were loaded onto carts and transported sometimes hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands, to Mongol camps where they would work for the rest of their lives. They would never see their homes again. They would never see their families again. They simply disappeared into the interior of an empire too large to cross on foot. The second phase was distribution. Younger women and girls were sorted and allocated to soldiers as rewards for battlefield performance, to officers as acknowledgement of rank, to noblemen as additions to the vast household camps that followed the army across the steppe. A senior Mongol commander might have dozens of women in his camp, all of them managed by his primary wife, all of them working, all of them with no legal standing, no path home, and no recourse. And the third phase, the one that Juvaini and other chroniclers recorded with visible discomfort, even in an era accustomed to writing about mass death, was the open slave market. Women who were not selected in the first 2 phases were sold, directly, openly, without apology. The Mongol slave trade grew into one of the largest commercial enterprises in the entire empire. Women were bought and sold between tribes, traded across the continent, shipped along the empire's famous postal road system, the same roads that historians celebrate for carrying silk and spice and ideas from one end of the world to the other. Those roads also carried human beings. Some of those women ended up in places called caravan hostels, rest stops built along the trade routes for merchants and soldiers and travelers. The women placed in these hostels had no choice about who they served or when. They spent the rest of their lives there. Merchants passed through, soldiers passed through, caravan drivers passed through. The women remained. Pasha had been telling William all of this for some time now. Not all at once, it came in pieces, the way difficult things always do, between other subjects around the edges of questions he asked about the empire's structure and geography and trade. He had been listening as a diplomat listens, carefully, systematically, taking notes. But somewhere in the middle of her account, he could not have said exactly when he stopped listening as a diplomat. He looked at her, really looked. She had walked from Hungary to Mongolia, on foot. That was not a metaphor or an approximation. It was a literal description of what her body had done. He had made the same journey on horseback with guides, with provisions representing the protection of the French crown. It had nearly broken him. She had done it as a captive, young, alone among strangers whose language she did not speak. And she was here, alive, with a husband and children and a name that someone he had written down. He asked her carefully how she was now, whether she was. He searched for the right word. She considered the question for a moment. "Well enough off," she said. He wrote it down exactly as she said it. He did not add anything. He did not explain it. He did not need to. Well enough off. Not free, not happy, not whole, not home. Well enough off. William stared at those words for a long moment. Outside the camp continued its endless motion, the Mongol household moving as it always moved, following the army to wherever it was going next. Pasha would go with it. Her children would grow up in it. The tent they were sitting in would be packed onto a wagon and reassembled somewhere else hundreds of miles away, and the conversation they were having would become a memory she carried alone. Unless he wrote it down. He had more questions, many more. But there was one thing Pasha had not yet told him, one event she had been circling around since they began mentioning in fragments, and then pulling back from as if approaching something too large to look at directly. He had heard a version of it already. A document he carried, written by the Persian historian Juvaini, a man who had spent his career in the Mongol court, and whose accounts William had studied before his journey, contained a passage unlike anything else in the entire text. Juvaini had written about rivers of blood, about cities erased so completely that travellers could not find where they had stood. He had written about all of it in the measured, almost bureaucratic language of a court historian recording the deeds of great men. But there was one passage where his language changed entirely, where he set aside the careful prose and reached for words like violence and fury and awesomeness, words he had not used anywhere else in hundreds of pages. He called the victims star-like maidens. William had read that passage 3 times on the journey east and had not understood it. Had not understood what could make a man who described mass destruction without apparent distress suddenly reach for language like that. He understood now that Pasha knew. He leaned forward. "Tell me," he said, "about 1237. Pasha did not answer immediately. She set down whatever she had been holding in her hands. She looked at the entrance of the tent where her children were playing in the pale winter light just outside. She watched them for a moment, the way a mother watches children when she is about to say something she does not want them to hear. Then she turned back to William. She had not been there herself, she told him. She had been a child in France in 1237 years before the Mongol armies reached Hungary. But in the camps, in the long years of moving from one end of the empire to the other, you heard things. Women talked. In the hours before dawn, when the camp was quiet and the men were sleeping, women from every corner of the known world sat together and traded the only currency they had left: stories. And the story